So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to let you know some of what I've been finding out over the last several years, pulling data together for this project. Just
Hold on just a second, we get it up there.
Yeah. For those, just to let people know, I actually grew up here looking for something to find, and that's a phrase that you'll hear me say again. That's actually a photo of me in the Idaho Statesman in 1975. That is obviously not Astragalus malfortii. That is Trifolium oetiense. I got used to media getting things wrong early on. But anyhow, so I went to, I got my undergrad at College of Idaho. So in the 1970s, I was collecting, I kind of went through and tried getting at least a tally of things I collected in the Boise Front. And I've made ongoing collections before I moved back as well. But just, emphasizing, I've got experience, personal experience in the Boise Front since the 1960s, growing up, wandering around, looking for something to find. And then I spent my career as a professional botanist, but still with the focus on Western North American flora, before returning home to Boise in around 2005, but it was transition. Continued kind of casually working on the Boise flora, but then during the COVID shutdown, that became my primary project. And so that's what I've been working on, putting together the results in an online format, thanks to the help of Paul Schaefer way back in the corner. And because it seemed like the way to make the results immediately available while still allowing me to continue making more results. So there I am with Aussie's Onion. So this is the homepage of the website, an ongoing work in progress. It's combined with outreach. I mean, you can see the, see, how does this, yeah, let's
get over to that screen.
Oh, it's just kind of, oops, no, that didn't work. Yeah.
You get it over on that screen or different screens.
Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha. Okay. So I mean, it's now even got some blog posts that I've been adding when I get, but I've got so much stuff going on. It's incremental, glacial sometimes that it's doing, because a lot of what I've been working on is really, there's a spreadsheet behind all of this. And updating that spreadsheet is where most of the work has been happening. So the coverage that I decided is kind of a weird thing. It's not a county. There's Boise in the very center. What I wanted to do was, I wanted to encourage people to appreciate what's local. And so where's the maximum diversity on public access trails within about an hour's drive of downtown Boise. So that's what was going on here. So it ended up being, I used Highway 55 as a boundary rather than wandering too far into Eagle. Highway 21 kind of forms a boundary, Blacks Creek Kuna Road, and just some of it was still fuzzy. But it includes then a 5,000-foot elevation range, 500 square miles, and I have it divided into 8 biogeographic units that I'll discuss more later. Okay, and I also want to emphasize what I've been doing is original research. It's not just data mining. I have thousands of hours spent on the ground, surveys, species lists, collections, plants. Of course, part of this is I wanted an excuse to get out and spend time outdoors. Yeah. But it also takes, and I also want to emphasize that deleting the erroneous reports is as important as adding. Which means checking the herbarium specimens at Boise State and C of I. If it was a possible addition that I said, oh, am I sure about that? Or so otherwise. And I would then, being a trained taxonomist, know how to use multiple sources, sometimes practically revise, contact the authorities, and whatever it took. Okay, so this is an older thing, but it gives you the general ballpark of how it divvies out. Over 1,000 species total, broken into native, non-native. There's actually some that they don't clearly fall into one or the other, or you have both native and non-native representatives. But the total is over 1,000, okay? And you can also break it down then into the percentage. This is looking a little bit, more. Okay, for one thing, the local flora turned out to be surprisingly unbotanized, that I easily doubled the number of species within this area. And I'm actually now up to 1,120 taxa. But the important thing I wanted to point out here, native forbs are by far the largest category, even larger than all the non-natives combined. And yet most of our management looks at the shrubs and the grasses. And, you know, I'm glad that we're now including a few forbs. But it's still, I consider those are the ones on the arc. Okay, and so breaking it down a different way, just looking at the natives, I then have the natives subdivided into whether they're only known for historical records, whether, you know, just kind of, this is a very subjective and very mobile, you know, it's changing. What I call my sensitive group, the orange, the brownish ones there, which are either on the INPS list or there's, say, less than 10 populations. There's not that many populations out there. And that's over 1/4. I mean, actually, the historical plus those is nearly 1/3 of our flora is really rare locally. They might not be rare statewide, but they're rare locally or extirpated potentially. Though every now and then I've managed to relocate and extirpate it, you know, one of them would move around. So, okay, and also again, management plants focus on the woodies, grasses, and a handful of the dominant and rare forbs. Majority of forbs are not being monitored, which means a major chunk of our local biodiversity could be bleeding away with no one paying attention. I mean, this is one of the points that I will be homing on for this talk. Okay, and this brings us to the idea, now it's time to introduce the shifting baseline. A lot of you are very familiar with the syndrome, but for those of you who aren't, it's also called generational ecological amnesia. But it's the understanding that this is, you know, a quick and easy definition, gradual change in the accepted norms for the conditions of the natural environment due to lack of experience, memory, and knowledge of past condition. But basically, what each generation considers to be a healthy environment based on, the starting point for them, past generations would be considered degraded. And future generations, you know, what, you know, is degraded now, future generations would think that's the new normal. That's what the shifting baseline is. Okay, and this is why it's useful that I have this experience going back to the 70s, you know, in my own personal, I mean, it's still just to the 70s, but, so this is this going on for us? Okay, and actually, this is a great book in California. I brought a copy of it along. It was the wake-up call in California of California's fading wildflowers, lost legacy and biological invasions. It mostly is focused on challenging the assumption that, well, what was here before was grasses, and so that's what we needed to restore with. And he scoured the early literature, notes by, you know, Spanish missionaries, whatever he could put his hands on. So actually everybody keeps talking about wildflowers, not grasses. So, but, you know, it's part of the shifting baseline again. And so has the same thing been happening in Boise Front and other semi-arid areas is the question that I'm pursuing with this talk. Okay. So vanishing wildflowers in the Boise Front, a photo from 2000. There's, as you can tell by the lack of buildings downtown compared to our shifting baseline now, which is still more than in the 1970s, but I don't have good photos from the 1970s. So anyhow, first question, has the same decline been happening in the Boise Front and other semi-arid areas? Okay, so here's a picture of the shifting baseline that, you know, most of us might react to, ooh, pretty well, you know, balsam root. Okay. The first one is actually some of the best quality you can still find. Second one is actually, there's a lot of pretty balsam root there, but there's an awful lot of invaded. That's a degraded habitat. And you still might say, oh, look at the pretty balsam root in the last one, but those are walking dead. I mean, they are so dominated by invasive grasses, they can't reproduce in that. They're long-lived, so they'll keep persisting. But they're waving bye-bye. Okay, so I think, yeah, we've got some decline. Well, actually, I haven't given you the evidence of that, but yes, it is happening other than a few photos. But what are the sources that allow us to address this question? This would be one of Carol Prentice's favorite things, had to go back into, so some of the earliest collections locally would be by Timothy Wilcox that I gave a talk on earlier, who collected at least 76 extant specimens from the Boise area that included Indian tobacco, tall century, and even Packard's cow pie buckwheat, supposedly from Boise. And whether it was really from Boise or he just happened to collect it and put Boise, as he's going back and forth to Idaho, Silver City, I don't know. But the Indian tobacco could have been because that was cultivated by the Native Americans. It's hard to say. Okay, there's not collections, but there's observations from Mary Halleck Foote, if you go through all of her writings, including the fiction, because she always wrote from what she observed. And so at the time, the railroad to get to Boise, you got off at Kuna, and then took a stage, or in this case, her husband picked her up. Not a tree in sight, but miles and miles of pallid sagebrush. We have no record, for the most part, of what used to be in this half of in the Treasure Valley. That's gone. It's disappeared ecosystem. When there were miles and miles of sagebrush with meadowlarks, this is between Kuna and Boise, okay? Wildflowers hid in the sage beneath those jets of songs. The bird and the wind filled the vast brooding silence. Silence? The desert wind that talks, that whispers to bring messages. But anyhow, it's this is hints anyhow of what it was like. And then we have the early College of Idaho botanist, William Judson Boone, the founder, who was also a botanist, came in 1887 to Caldwell. I can find about 20 collections of his from the Boise area. His successor, Harold Tucker, made another 70 collections. But the quote, so there's this, in the biography of Boone, it talks about in those early days, a few minutes hike to Indian Creek or Canyon Hill brought dozens of species at Caldwell that now you have to search for in the more, that, by that time even, you had to search for in more distant foothills. Now, they're no longer, a lot of these same plants aren't at the lower elevations. You have to go increasingly remote from Boise. A couple of other early collectors, Isabel Mulford's made a trip in the 1892, several collections from Boise, including, surprise, the type of Astragalus mulfortii. Francis McBride, I've been spending more time. He grew up in New Plymouth, went to Boise High School, sends his collections to Ava Nelson University, Wyoming, eventually, does a degree there. Has about 30 collections from Boise, including the type of Astragalus sedanus, some other things that disappeared in synonymy, but still part of that early documentation of what was here. I'm intrigued by June Clark, a student at University of Idaho, who made about 300 collections in 1911, including the types of Viola Clarkii, which has been submerged, and Bernice Bjornson, who wrote the first flora of Southwest Idaho, also at at University of Idaho. I like the fact that so many of these early collectors are women. And I'd like to find out more about both of these people, but they may have gotten married, changed their last name, so searches can't pick it up if you don't know. But when I was a student at Boise High School myself, we still had a stack of these mimeographed floras, and I made sure to keep a couple when I realized they were probably going to get rid of. And they're a gold mine that I'm gradually extracting nuggets from these and putting them to the website. But some of the nuggets, when she talks about Idaho Scapigera, pepper pods, so called by children who eat the pods, meaning it was so abundant in the Boise area that children would eat the pods as, one of the things you do. And you have trouble finding it in the lower foothills. Primula cusiciana. Okay, so this was written in 1946. And Bjornson saying people who lived in southwestern Idaho in the early 1900s tell us that in spring, the foothills used to be a mass of color with these flowers. Surely this is a flower which need protection. One has to hunt for it nowadays. This was in 1946. It's not got any easier to find. And then realizing that Wilcox's collection was actually from the Boise barracks. That's how, it might have been down here on the flats. So, it's possible to glean nuggets of information of how common was it earlier. by going through all this stuff. And just to give you a sense, yes, we have plenty of other collections since then, just summarizing some of the stuff that people have done, including numerous student collections for plant systematics classes at Boise State, back when it was even Boise Junior College. But anyhow, so, it's been building up, but it's still, a lot of this is spring stuff. After spring, people head to the high country. So that's why, one reason why there was still a lot of botanizing to do. Okay, so what changes have I personally observed growing up here? Okay, here's one thing. Here's some plants I personally collected in Cottonwood Creek area, military reserve, that I haven't been able to relocate during my recent stuff. I mean, they might still be out there, but it just say, okay, cumulatively, things have been disappearing. And there's things that haven't disappeared. I used to have no trouble finding yellow cushion buckwheat, bluebells, and some other things. I mean, yes, we can still find the bulbous woodland star easily enough, but it's findable rather than abundant. I mean, my memory is you walked out, there it was. And on the other direction, apparently I'm the first collection of both rush skeleton weed and goat head. Partially because, people weren't collecting these weeds that weren't blooming in spring from the Boise Front. And I didn't collect the first bachelor buttons and feral rye, but my memory is they weren't nearly as common as they are now. So that's one of the things going on. Also throw in, there's animal, I used to find Great Basin ground squirrels in the central foothills. I haven't seen those. I don't see rabbit tracks in the snow like I used to. I once caught a horned lizard on camel's back. So, all of these, some of these might have other things. I mean, loose dogs, cats, poisons, a lot of things going on, but the decline in good floral quality is one of the other things that could be affecting these. Okay, and basically, I used to find a lot more of the first kind of habitat. That was the norm. And not that much of the other kind of, to the left. Right, okay. The other right. Okay, so, that's some of the historical sources. So next question, what about some of the species that are in the greatest danger? Okay, and this is where the database that I've been working on is now useful enough to start helping. Okay, so start out pointing out, these are some of the rare plants that are actually being monitored. Aussie's onion, Milford's milk vetch, slick spot peppergrass, Sacagawea bitterroot, anybody who wants to do changes to the landscape on public lands has to monitor for these. At least that's my understanding. We've actually got a bunch of other plants on the Idaho rare plant list that, to my knowledge, aren't quite kept up as much for. Well, we just added another one today. I think a Remocarpus at S3. Does that count? Anyhow, basically, they're not being given as much attention. In addition to those, there's at least 200 additional native vascular plants, mostly wildflowers, that are either vulnerable to extinction, extirpation, or have already been eliminated locally. 200. None of which are on the radar screen for management or modification activities. We're not tracking them. Q6 bluebell, that's when I found a population, small population, extremely vulnerable. It's one of the only known ones, certainly the only one I know locally, and possibly one of the only ones in the state. Don't know. Okay, so what are the causes? Okay, death by 1,000 cuts, easiest way to say it. There's direct loss of habitat to agriculture and development. Grazing, especially historical wildfires and post-fire remediation. Narrow focus land management activities. I mean, when you're just focused on fuel reduction, when you're just focused on recreational goals. And they're all made worse by invasive non-natives. There's what, I found the first brush skeleton weed, well, it's obviously spread a little bit more. We used to.
What's the first brush skeleton weed found?
In the 70s. Well, at least in Ada County, that was my collection. There were some from up near Lucky Peak a few years later. So it was showing up, but it was still, oh, look at this plant I've never seen before. This is cool. No, okay. Okay, so, what do I have against non-natives? I mean, for those of you, this audience might understand already, but okay, still worth, okay. I've run into this. Why don't we just welcome them? Doesn't it add to the biodiversity? Isn't it speciesism? I've heard that word to discriminate against these plant refugees. And okay, so this is why I say it's not non-native per se, but specifically those that are invasive that can actually change the habitat and displace native biodiversity. Okay, and the black ones are the percentage that I have marked based on my own criteria. They might be on a list, they might just be, these are the things that I've been seeing being a problem for whatever reason. 63 invasive species that just look like they have a strong potential for displacing native diversity. There's, also 38 waifs that may or may not even, get much more of a foothold, but I'm putting them down for now. It's kind of hard knowing which ones. Some persisting, meaning, okay, the lilacs on the orchard trail, but you run across, they're out there, they're not really spreading. But anyhow, out of 400 total natives, there's only 16% that are the bad, the invasives to worry about. I actually kind of like some of the ones in the 72%. I don't worry about them, or else they're not here. Okay, and this, is my highly technical graph, which I actually used in my Botany 2024 talk, which, I just wanted to get the concept across. There's no actual data behind, that's the numbers. It's just, but it gets, yes. Okay, so if you look at that black line, as non-natives show up, the red line, yes, the number of total species in an area starts out increasing. So yeah, I mean, the first thing you get is an increase in biodiversity. But then the invasives in particular really get going and the natives start plummeting. In fact, even some of the other non-natives start plummeting compared to the invasive ones. And you end up with more and more of the non-native and less of everything else. So that's why it's a problem. It's not just additive. So also invasive species equal habitat loss. Because what the invasives do, they transform the habitat into a novel habitat that our natives are not adapted to. I'll get into that. So, and this is what I can walk along Camel's Back, that you can still see a lot of open space with the natives on the left side, but right side solid feral rye. And it's spreading, but it's more complicated. And one of the key features is the fact that our native ecosystem in the arid zones heavily depends on this biotic or cryptogamic crust. It's a critical component of an intact shrub steppe community. It provides the germination site for native seedlings. They need these open spaces to germinate. It helps retain soil moisture and nutrients. It reduces soil erosion. It provides the nitrogen because you got nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria. And it can even reduce the germination of cheatgrass seeds if you have it intact. So all those lichens, those little white patches, and so what looks like bare ground isn't. That's actually an extremely complex, important part of the ecosystem. And that's kind of the root of it. Okay, so in contrast, fall are the worst non-native annual grasses, the invasives, will germinate in the fall, tie up all the nutrients, tie up all the space, tie up all the water, form a solid thatch then that our native decomposers don't know what to do with. So it just builds up and becomes fire prone. And basically there's no room for natives to germinate in that. It just crowds them out, shades them out. And even long-lived balsam root, gradually loses the battle if it can't germinate to replace as the older ones die. Okay, so this shrub steppe, unfortunately, is highly vulnerable to disturbance, and the disturbance favors the invasive non-natives. So the original shrub steppe, lots of wildflowers, good wildlife habitat, resistant to wildflowers. After the natives take over, few wildflowers, very poor wildlife habitat, very prone to wildfires. Okay, is that simple enough for you? This is even simpler. Easy to turn from high diversity to monoculture non-natives. Very, very difficult to reverse. Don't just think you can go and bulldoze and expect, oh, it'll grow back. No, it'll grow back, but not to what you want it to. Okay, so mention grazing. What about grazing? Well, this is sometimes even said that's the solution to helping it go back. Well, I'll try to be nuanced about this. Okay. Okay, the frequently invoked benefits of grazing, I'm not arguing against these, that they maintain, the grazing can maintain a mosaic of the habitats that is necessary for biodiversity and grassland. Grassland that co-evolved with herds of large herbivores. Key phrase. Okay, it can reduce the biomass of invasive non-natives. I mean, you put the cows out to get rid of the cheatgrass, right? Including the thatch, which makes room for the natives, supposedly. It reduces the fuel load and associated wildfire danger. Sorry. And yeah, it's economic and cultural importance, especially for rural communities, though sometimes the economic is marginal, but anyhow, I'm not going to argue against any of those. I mean, but what gets glossed over is it comes with downsides as well. I'm not saying those other ones aren't true, but let's look at the full picture. Sagebrush steppe did not co-evolve with large herds of bovines and sheep. We had occasional buffalo wandering through here, but this is not a good habitat for them. The biotic crust is damaged and destroyed by trampling, which then sets the stage for non-natives to move in. And the riparian habitat is disproportionately impacted by cattle. So, the native forbs along stream sides just get totally reduced. Okay, continued. The primary beneficiaries of moderate grazing are low palatability plants in degraded habitats that are already degraded, already dominated by native grasses. Yeah, I'll go along that some grazing might be a good idea, can help. However, even in that, you're still selecting against and eventually extirpating the most palatable herbs or plants that lack adaptations to regular grazing. Say bye-bye to Brown's peony if you're grazing cows. They seem to love it. Cow candy, I call these particular things. And in addition, range that is managed for grazing is preferentially cedar. We're shifting away from this some, we've still got a long ways to go. With non-native perennial grasses at the expense of native diversity. And what you end up with is low diversity pastureland, which is now the dominant habitat in much of the mid-elevation Boise Front. I mean, this is painted as the beauty of the Boise Hills I've seen. But same way that the Golden Hills of California show up in paintings, but no, they show, you don't find many wildflowers in that habitat. I mean, I can speak from experience. If I want to go find look for interesting wildflowers, I don't go wandering through this stuff. There's a few there. I mean, there's the ones that can tolerate the grazing regime, but it's not the diversity. It's not the cool stuff. Okay, so how about wildfires? How do they affect the situation? Okay, pre-invasion, before we had invasive non-natives, this is a critical thing. Before invasive non-natives were part of the equation, the sagebrush steppe was quite resilient. I mean, it could self-restored by resprouts. There's a bit of brush coming back. Seed dispersal, the seed bank, seed dispersal from nearby pioneering native species. I mean, as long as sagebrush wasn't too far away, it happily dumped seeds that loved the fresh ground. So, so it could, handle wildfires. However, different story when you add invasives to the equation. It becomes susceptible to complete and permanent takeover by non-native species, and the fire just exacerbates it. In addition to the fire itself, it's often the aggressive post-fire remediation that can be at the expense of the biotic crust, resprouting natives, and whatever else is in the seed bank. They treat it as a blank slate often. And then they'll come through sometimes, and, you know, fortunately, again, this is changing. It's still a pretty entrenched, and what's already happened is out there. Post-fire seeding of non-native perennial grasses to improve the range has actually been a common practice. Okay, so causes, why does it matter? We were talking with somebody about this earlier. Okay, basically, to me, the more, I mean, I could probably come up with a better way to phrase this, but the more our local biodiversity is impoverished, the more we're impoverished. I mean, would you rather go for a walk through the first picture or the second picture? I think even people who say plants don't matter would say they would prefer a walk among the wildflowers. That's part of what makes it neat, beautiful. Okay, second reason, okay, this is the other thing. Plants are foundational components of biodiversity in their own right, not just because of the animals they support. We tend to, you know, I don't hear that said much. It's always plants are important because of which animals. No, they're part of biodiversity in themselves. I know Idaho Native Plant Society preaching to the choir, but the rest of you need to go preach that too. Okay. Also, global biodiversity is the sum of local biodiversity. I mean, we might think, oh, it's just our little local stuff. Our stuff's common elsewhere. You know, what difference does it make? No. Biodiversity is the sum of local biodiversity, including the variation within species. The more local biodiversity is lost, the closer global biodiversity edges towards extinction. Ours is a piece of the whole. It matters. Okay, and finally, some of this local variation turns out to be taxonomically distinct. So recently described, the Boise sand verbena in 2016, the Anderson's biscuit root in 2018. So, you know, Boise sand verbena growing above Hill Road near Cartwright Road. And then looking down at Boise State University from that nice patch of Anderson's biscuit root. I mean, right next to our backyards. Boise sand verbena, I found this old specimen that said quite common on sandy slopes back in 1911. By the time I got around to describing it in 2015, I could find all of 100 plants in the whole world. I mean, that doesn't count what's in the seed bank, which could be a significant amount. But I mean, it just shows how much it was going downhill. We got other things that I figure are candidates for, you know, if somebody looks at this closer, there might need to be split out some local stuff about there. And here's an article I did with Mark Skinner back in 1993, where we were pointing out that taxonomic concepts in the names are hypotheses. And so if you're having to decide whether or not, this came up in our talk, our meeting, Rare Plant Working Group meeting this morning, about whether to accept a lumping or a splitting. And Mark was the one who came up with the phrase of, you know, trying to avoid lamentation over taxa that are shown to be distinct only after their disappearance. I mean, that's where the Abronia was heading. And again, the taxonomy, I misspelled that, sorry. The latest word is not necessarily the last, but extinction is forever. So not unique phrase, but combined with taxonomy. So anyhow, just kind of keep in mind that, you know, we don't know which of our stuff might turn out to be distinct, and we wait until it's gone extinct before we realize it. Okay, so now the important part, what can be done to save our local wildflower diversity? Okay, and okay, number one most important thing above all else, the less you disturb good quality shrub stuff in the first place, that's the best thing. That's the most, you know, useful way to save it. Don't disturb it in the first place. It's already a rare and increasing habitat. Once lost, reversal is extremely problematic. And at best, restoration can only involve only a small fraction of the original diversity. I mean, we're not going to replant 200 species or 400 or whatever. It's just not there. Okay, here's a picture I took that showed the sagebrush steppe that got bulldozed on the left, and no, it got bulldozed on the right. And so the remnant is on the left, and got replanted with non-native grasses. 4 years or so later, it's not going to go back to what it was. That's now permanently in that new trajectory without a lot of effort. And challenges to even the best practice restoration rehab. The reason this is a problem, the disturbance usually destroys the crust. And the crust is so critical to everything else. So hundreds of natives present in the Boise Front, way more than can be propagated for restoration. And even the commercially available native species is only a subset of easily propagated ecotypes. And to me, I look at these, again, pulling back to what was here in the 1970s. What we had is the plant on the left is what represented blue bunch wheatgrass. Scattered plant, small, tough, scattered, blending into the local habitat. Now I come back, and in areas where I know it's been burned, so it would have been reseeded, I can find this different ecotype that forms these much denser tufts, grows together, and it crowds out the natives. I mean, even it's a native species, but it's not our native ecotype. This is why, you have to be careful. Okay, second thing, take action against invasive species. This is the second most important. And you prioritize relatively intact habitats first. You're trying to save those most intact stuff first. That's the whole point. Think of a firefighting analogy. You focus on containment and wiping out any hot spots. So any new populations you try to get rid of. While at the same time, and this is what's often overlooked, minimize damage to existing natives. What you don't want to do is say, the operation was a success. We got rid of the non-native, but the patient died. I mean, that's too often the approach. You only look at the one goal. And no, we want to minimize what we're doing to the rest. Bradley method is, I'll mention that in the next slide, but also combined with early detection of novel invasives. So Bradley method, as explained, it basically is a technique that works with the plants. It uses a naturalist approach by encouraging the native vegetation to become reestablished. So you start with a largely intact area, you work at the edges and gradually try to allow the native stuff to reclaim the disturbed site. So, we like to jump into the middle and feel like we're doing great by getting rid of, the heart of non-natives. But if the natives then can't recolonize easily, it's wasted effort. So I highly recommend Googling this, finding out more about it. Okay, bringing attention to new invasives. I mean, we did get a little bit of thing with this population of Kogan grass that turned out to be showing up. And it actually got sprayed. Since it was such a noxious, worldwide noxious weed, it got attention. However, that's actually wasn't as nearly as much threat, in my opinion, to the plants of the Boise Front as a whole bunch of other things that aren't getting attention. We do not have a good system locally or in Idaho for jumping on and doing something about new invasives. That, again, it's hard. How do you tell it's an invasive? I could probably sit down and come up with okay. In some ways, for me, it's a sense, but I could parse out exactly what goes into that sense. What are the things that are spreading too fast? What do too well? If they're known to be a problem elsewhere, that helps. And it's hard because, okay, here's some things that I've actually found jumping the fence from gardens locally. And I don't know which of these are going to be taking off. Some of them could turn out to be problems. Russian sage might be one of our future. Remember, I collected the first skeleton weed locally. I couldn't tell from that time what its future was going to be. And just to complicate the things, we have a bunch of native, non-native lookalikes. We've got, in addition to our native dogwood along the river, a non-native dogwood that, for all I know, people are propagating the non-native and using it for restoration. You don't know, or just assuming. So just kind of keeping track. By the way, the most common flax planted in foothills isn't native. That is not Lewis's flax. You do have Lewis's flax up on Schaefer Butte or in the high country, but what we have down here, it's pretty. It can fill maybe other functions, in terms of just adding color. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say it's pointless, but it's, don't think that you're planting native. You know, become a weed warrior if you're not already. You know, whether you work individually, but Martha Braybeck does have this nice organized attempt to try to get it out. Okay. And then to me, the most important, you know, other thing that I want to talk about a lot is you taking regionally sensitive plant species into consideration when planning for mitigating land management. Again, native plants are important in their own right. They can easily decline and disappear without anyone noticing, even if other metrics imply ecosystem health. And they are prime indicators of intact versus degraded shrub steppe. Okay, we did hear from Matt Lavina at one of a talk last March, a year ago, okay. And also published that he's got his 8 functional groups. So this is kind of a shortcut for deciding, okay, is this good quality habitat if it's got most of these or many of these? So it's at least, you know, you don't have to identify everything. You can just put them into functional groups. So that's useful. Okay, so part of what I've been doing is, you know, putting my own idea on which things count as regionally sensitive. 178 plants is a starting point list. I mean, I don't claim it to be anywhere more than that. But I want to compare it to a similar list in the East Bay, which is part of what got me started, what I'm thinking of. Okay, and this is the rare, unusual, and significant plants of Alameda, Contra Costa County. Diane Lake spearheaded this. It was actually done in tandem with my work on the annotated checklist of the same area. So I was just working on the checklist, but she was trying to then home in on this group of what she called unusual plants that she came up with some criteria for. It's been an ongoing project. But you know, she points out it's not just about preserving the individual species, but also determining local botanical areas of native plant diversity, defining places with threatened habitats or suites of endangered plants, patterns and trends, areas of need and study, or other things. So it's generally useful. And they've been doing this for over 30 years. And the resultant list has been, ends up being something that is really used by the agencies, organizations. It's very useful. And this is why I'm wondering, could we be doing something similar in the Boise Front? Okay, and so if anybody would like to help with something like this, I told you it would be another. For those of you who like to get outdoors, go look for something to find. You know, one thing is, okay, take some of these ones that are known only historically, see if you can refine it. I mean, I haven't had time to look for half of this stuff. Try to find new localities of things. Just get out there and find stuff. Okay. Okay. Okay, and choose what appeals to you in the look for something to find. I mean, you could go after the historic collections. You could pick your favorite sensitive plants and try to find more of it, maybe to monitor. Search for something to find in more remote areas. I rarely go more than a few miles from the trailheads that I can drive to easily. So there's huge swaths of especially the middle elevations and conifer zone, MECZ, as well as LP, Lucky Peak area that I'm not going to get to. I haven't driven the Ridge Road even. So lots more places to explore. Okay, and if you want to know, well, how do I know which ones are sensitive? Well, this is the search page that Paul created on my website, the Treasure of the Boise Front. And if you find your way to species list and you advanced search, and you click under distribution for foothills, for example, or any of the other distributions, and then sensitive, it will generate a list of what things I have considered in that category from that area. And you can also then, once you have that list of names, go to the Consortium of Pacific Northwest Herbaria. In this case, I put in Calanthus from Ada County. And it generated 15 matching records. For some of those are from Southern Ada County. We're not interested in that. I'm not. But anyhow, and that one can give you more exact localities. If you want to know, you know, where's it already known, go look at it. If you find a new one. You can also look at the species pages. so here's Gilead, Brecciarum, the Nevada Gilead. And I've been taking photographs of the local variation, just in case it's unique, with as many of the diagnostic characters. So you can get a search image of what to look for. So these are some of the tools. Okay, so you want to get, if you go out there, how should you document? Well, herbarium specimens to me are still the gold standard because you can always go back and double check the identification. But I'm certainly in favor of iNaturalist. In fact, I think this would be a great project maybe to build on iNaturalist specific to this website and, or, you know, this project. I don't know, but somebody else would have to be doing that. She said, looking at, anyhow, and if you do the iNaturalist, be sure to take more than just a single photo, you know, make sure you get the picture of the whole plant and the close-up of the flower, the leaf, and anything else that you think is diagnostic. Because you can get multiple photos for each record. Okay, then if you would rather not be out looking for something to find in the foothills in the wild, there's also opportunities if you just like working on the computer, looking for stuff, and you can scour historical records and currents, you know, find other forms of data. I haven't even exhausted what's in the consortium yet. In terms of sitting and, okay, this is my list. What did I miss? I found a few more things while working on this, by the way. Apparently, yeah, so. But those, you know, then I'd like to be able to look at the specimen to verify, am I comfortable that that's the correct thing? Additional localities, as well as, are there more little hints like Mary Halleck Fuchs writing? Are there other old documents that would give information that give us a hint of what was common, more common, what's changed? Some sources, you know, in addition to the Consortium of Pacific Northwest Herbaria, there's the Intermountain Regional Herbarium Network and the Rocky Mountain Herbarium Database are all some of the main ones. And of course, iNaturalist itself, I have not yet gone through the iNaturalist records to see if there's anything there. By the way, if you do the iNaturalist, it will also give you a suggested identification. It comes in with this identification app. It might not be right, but at least someplace to start. Okay. Also, though, keep in mind that because of the way I defined my area, it's not easy to just say, find everything in this area. Because it's only the north half of Ada County. We don't want all of Ada County. And there's also a lot of Boise County, you know, Boise County. And there's stuff in Boise County that says it's in Ada County and vice versa, just to complicate things. And these searches often allow you to draw a polygon, but that only captures the georeference stuff. So, and remember that even annotated specimens might need the identifications changed, including my own. You know, that's just the name of the game. Okay, so, and that's where we get to checking the identification of herbarium specimens. This is another activity that people can do. I mean, at College of Idaho, Boise State, and we're starting a Boise State Herbarium Play Day, as well as the College of Idaho Play Day. So, you know, basically searching for the voucher of, wait a minute, this is supposed to be here. I need to go look at this. So possible additions and anything else with a suspect identification. You know, is this old collection really Trifolium douglasii, for example? Morris Creek, Ada County, obviously not Ada County, Morris, well, it could be, yeah, right below the bridge. Okay, which is now flooded. You know, I tried looking for this thing, found a different clover, but not this one. Okay, and then help, oh, this is where I need help. You know, develop databases and other tools that will aid these efforts and make the resultant information widely available, especially for land managers. So, you know, there could be an iNaturalist project for somebody who's really into iNaturalist. And at this point, I'll also mention the City Nature Challenge again, April 26th, 29th. That's all of Ada County, but same time to get out and look for plants of this category and see if we can beat, you know, we should get a competition going maybe with Moscow and Pocatello to see, you know, which city in Idaho can come up with the most. This is a competition between, you know, different groups. It was originally the competition between Los Angeles and San Francisco to who could come up with the most biodiversity within their area. And it's been expanded internationally. We're not going to compete with San Francisco and all the people who are into it, but we could compete with Moscow and Pocatello.
It can be our ringer.
Or maybe other chapters. We could do that, okay. I'm actually also thinking, okay, I mentioned, this is something I threw out in one of my first talks. It was premature, but maybe now it's time to start, now I've got more of the background information to give a number on each of these sensitive plants and challenge people throughout the year to go out and see who can rack up the most points. It's kind of a combination of a natural geocache and a video game. So, try to figure out what might work. And this, again, I'd need somebody to work with, but hey, it has some ideas. Okay, but this is really the most, what we end up with, hopefully, would be this database that could be used by land management activities, helping to identify the hotspot clusters, let them know where there is something that they could maybe, if they can go around it, minimize disturbance, and prioritize conservation efforts. To the extent that they care about plants, that is, but that's another problem. Here's two examples where lack of information caused problems. The Heroes Trail goes right through this tiny population of fritillary that I've been monitoring since I grew up. And I was heartbroken to see the trail go right through the middle of this population. It was one of the only populations in the lower foothills. And it will probably now, because trail, disturbance tends to change, or people will be picking it, or dogs will be running across it. I don't have high hopes of that population now. So, but even worse, when I was just starting and checking out places, went to Lytle Gulch, and there was a Stragulus there, that little clumpy one at the front, which I said, this looks weird. It's a Stragulus pershii, but much more dense, and turned out, we decided, yes, Don Mansfield had some students work on it and said, no, it's actually a different variety than the common one. And I went back and half the population was bulldozed. I ended, talking to the land manager, it's a nice guy, or, the person, he said he'd reached out to the Native Plant Society when they wanted to put in this disc golf course and said, is there anything to worry about? We hadn't, at that time, we didn't know. If we had the database that people could check to say, oh, yeah, I see there is stuff that's interesting. It's still there, the plant, but half the habitat got wiped out, and it's hard to know what the disc golf activity will do in the long run. Okay, so recap, best way to make a difference: avoid disturbance in the first place, get rid of invasive species going into intact vegetation, the good quality, and trying to get more attention paid to the sensitive species list. I figure, if we can just focus on the sensitive species, that's a more manageable number to have to pay attention to. One more to add, advocate for all of these. So something else to do. More food for thought. In the same way that historical sources help us counteract the shifting baseline syndrome, current floristic variety, the work we're doing now is the baseline for the future. And floristic inventories are never complete. There's always something more to find. Either it's been overlooked, or keeping track of what's disappearing is tricky. Are you just not finding it, or is it actually disappearing? So even just in the last couple of years, I'm still finding new stuff. Shrub, Great Basin buckwheat, Virginia strawberry, alpine miderwort, cup clover, Rocky Mountain phlox, dark throat shooting star. There we go. And unfortunately, there's a steady rain of non-natives. Most of these are not going to be problems, but it's still mind-boggling how many keep showing up. Okay, I know, I've already used the hour, but I'll try to run through this rest because it's got the most pretty pictures and still has some. What?
We started a few minutes late.
Okay. So anyhow, I knew that I was squeezing a lot in, but I had a lot to say. So I'm just going to run through the different subunits, pointing out that, okay, we've got, starting from the bottom, the South Boise and Oregon Trail are in the Intermountain flora. They're actually in a different flora from the rest of them. Greenbelt, as I call it, is transitional. And then the ones in the Pacific Northwest are the foothills, west valleys, mid elevations, Lucky Peak Lake Reservoir, conifer zone. Okay, so South Boise is basically south of the interstate going to about Cunamora Road and Eagle Road. Increasingly degraded or converted sagebrush steppe, but there's still a rich floristic diversity in some of the seasonal wetlands in particular. Sensitive plants include, just some of the Minidoka penstemon's prettiest, but the other ones are cool in their own right. I like little mudflat things. Are these still present in South Boise? I don't know. We've been looking for the bogogeny without success, but the grass widows would be in bloom right now. Are a good chance of them. And trying to find where Anne DeBolt collected that Fraser and trying to get access back to. I hear it's kind of where the train cuts through that ridge there. But that would be neat to know. And just kind of, showing, from 1980, so maybe it's not really, but, we're losing stuff here. But this grows and this grows and this grows. And we know that, this is growing. It's all just treated as blank slate for whatever we want to use it for in the South Boise area. But it's actually an area, there's an urgent need for more preserved open space because this is some of the closest to what used to be where Boise is now. And it is part of our diversity. It adds some stuff that isn't there. So, that isn't otherwise known. So I'd like more work done there. Oregon Trail is what I called the area here. So it's kind of the other side of I-84, south of the Boise River. And it's where there were some basalt flows overlain by sediments. A lot of sensitive plants. Here's the hare's foot vetch, Kusickiella, big head clover, Lomatium macrocarpum. So some different things growing here that you don't find elsewhere in the Boise Front. You've got Mima-type mound intermound, even some vernal wetlands, stock ponds, but they're filling the same niche in this case. And threats, well, it's basically the sacrifice zone currently for recreation, motorized recreation in a lot of grades, encroaching development, general neglect. I don't know how sensitive plants are. There is a master plan. I figure that's good, but still like to see more. Okay, Greenbelt, gallery forest along the river of mixed native, non-native. Also includes all the residential areas of flatlands and even creeping up in the foothills. So pretty developed, but there's still some good stuff there. High aquatic diversity, some of the sensitive plants that are there. See some special habitats. Okay, the seasonally flooded riparian bottomlands are some of my favorites. But just showing out, the ones you can find on the right is, that's pretty, even though it's got a lot of non-natives in there, it's got a lot of natives too, on the left, I meant. And what we tend to do to those is we want to keep the green belt, but clear it out, open it up, and remove most of the diversity. And that's what's on best picture I could find to show that on the right. A lot of invasives. The Dyer's broom is one of the worst ones that isn't getting attention to. I think the European spindle tree, we really need to start targeting. Birch chervil's out of control long ago. Hoary mustard, I don't know. At least try to keep it confined. Okay, foothills. So this is the sedimentary bathtub ring of Lake Idaho. So it's as far up as the sediments go. And we got, pretty pictures of the things that are in this area. But here focusing on the open loose sand as a special habitat that a lot of these things grow on. And maybe focusing on this habitat rather than just the individual species. And the problem is what we've got is a suite of plants that are adapted to disturbance. But unfortunately, the non-natives are even better adapted to disturbance. That's the uphill battle. Some other open sand rarities. Okay, and of course, these sandy habitats also seem to be, with the good vegetation, is also the ones that you see development going on. Well, it's not clay, so it's a good, nice salt, more solid, frustrating. West Valley, I decided to carve out as its own unit because it's got greater geological diversity. And a lot of plants, some plants are actually more characteristic of the Hawaii flora, which is kind of interesting, and they jump across the Snake River Plains. A lot more exploration needed there. I've only barely, been on a few trips, explored just the nearby ones at Avamore Spring. I haven't been to Checker Butte. Some of the sense of, we got pellet milkweed there, freckled milkfish, camas along the creek. It's one of the only places you can find camas. Well, on the other hand, Spring Valley Ranch, now called Avamore, camas was documented there by Boone, Tucker, and Trueblood. There used to be camas there. Lingenfelter didn't collect. Lingenfelter did a lot of collections in 1949. Several of his things not only aren't there I haven't been able to find him there anymore, but I haven't found him anywhere in the flora. So we've got this lost flora of Spring Valley Ranch. And the ranch itself might have been one of the things that got rid of them, but just again, looking at the time lapse, 2004, we had a little bit of development going on here at the south end of the valley. There's the main ranch up there, I think. And it starts spreading and then spreads more, especially after the recession. Oh, now we're starting to bulldoze this area too, the ranch itself. And now it's starting to go up into the foothills and both sides of the road. And it's supposed to get all the way into Gem County even. Of course, this is the development that advertised its wildflower friendliness. Okay, but also, so this area right here, there's a small patch of unusual geology on this side of the road and here and over to here. It's the only place north of the Snake River Plains for purple sage. No protection. Some of this has been wiped out. Population there got bulldozed with a house put on it recently. I don't know. Mid elevations. Okay, so this is above the sediments at about 4,000 feet and below the conifer zone. Some sensitive plants, some good stuff to look for. Special habitats, the windswept ridge, outcrops. Okay, a lot of grazing. Lucky Peak Reservoir area, similar to mid-elevation with more aquatic habitats, even more sparsely botanized. Some of the sensitive plants, we've even got Eriogonum ovalifolia variety pansum coming in, bitterroot, one of Don's photographs at the top of Cervity. This isolated population of pedicactus with atypically pink flowers that Dale took me to. And are these still here? There's a collection of Eriogonum cespitosum that Bob Steele collected somewhere. And I've already mentioned the Trifolium deglacia. Oh, and another new weed to worry about. Spotted jewelweed has taken over the understory at Ruby Creek Park. Okay, conifer zone. Okay, this is an elevational island. It's got a lot of cool stuff and really needs more attention. It's separated from the next higher elevations. Sparsely botanized again, except at major access points. Lots of exploration potential. And it might turn out that some of the things I have on the well, everywhere it could be, that some of the things I have as sensitive actually are quite common, are wide enough spread to not have to be sensitive. But I don't know what additional species are present. This is one of the main places I keep adding things. Special habitats, the natural rock garden, seepage and springs, densely shaded understory, wet meadows, some of the sensitive plants, quickly. I love the Everman's pincushion. Some of the ones in wets, yes, we've got 3 different orchids there. Ferns, a couple more of the orchids, pine drops. I'll also have to mention the Clear Creek area. This is on the back side. If you go turn on the Grimes Creek Road and then double back on Clear Creek Road, you get to what I think might be a remnant prairie. And I got clued into it because both June Clark in 1911 and Bernice Bjornson collected a lot of things that I wasn't finding anywhere else at a place called Clear Creek. And it's got mining history, so mostly private. But I was delighted when I found out Jess Irwin bought property there. So I was able to go finally, and I found all those things that I was expecting to find, including tufted penstemon. So added another rare plant to our local list. So that's pretty cool, as well as the violet that was named after, the synonym. Viola clarkii is probably a synonym, but that's the one named after June Clark. So that's kind of fun. Okay, so now we get to the bad side. What are the impacts on plant diversity by expanded recreation, forest thinning, climate change in general? Okay, here's a good question that nobody seems to know the answer to. What was Bogus Basin like pre-ski resort? Tucker and Boone and some others, collected Schaefer Butte, as they called it. I don't know how they got there. I think they may have come up from the Horseshoe Bend side. There was a community post office called Schaefer there, and apparently a reference to a sawmill. But the road construction for Bogus Basin Ski Resort began in 1938, constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, which I think was based where the campground is now. But again, this history and from the plants, I think that where Bogus Basin was the biggest meadow on this elevational island. Okay, so ongoing construction. We love, everybody wants to use it. Yeah, this is great. And I'm not saying it isn't, but it comes at the cost of intact habitat for sensitive plant species, most of which we have absolutely no data on what was there before or after construction. And the rehab's often, this is the worst part, rehabilitation with non-native pasture grasses. So at least, my proposal has been, and they've been talking with Dirk Sensitive about this, that maybe we can pick a few areas and put in interpretive trails that will help preserve some of the best quality habitat and make it part of the recreation system. So that's one possibility. Okay, we also have unknown impacts on full plant diversity by the forest thinning operations, which, you can read these articles, 2019 on, it will boost tree health, skier experience, everything's great and wonderful. We're gonna remove trees and replant with a more resilient species, ponderosa pine, make the forest in the area healthier and safer for recreations. Okay, all might be true, but what does this do to the plants that are there? No data. I mean, this is an extreme case of the masticating that I found going on. But there's no data on what sensitive plants were in this area before, what comes in after. I think they're going to have a hard time growing back through all that slush, though. As even if the soil wasn't disturbed, because some things need undisturbed soil, or they needed the shade that isn't there anymore. So, we don't, we're serving one purpose, but not everything. This disturbance also favors, these are the worst invasives there. We all know spotted knapweed, trying to get patience dock on the radar screen. That's actually a new invasive. It's like curly dock on steroids. It's also in the West Valley area and showing up some others, but it really loves the conifer zone. And any disturbance, it follows. So some closing thoughts. Okay. I'm willing to say, okay, if the benefits outweigh the cost, that sometimes happens. We decide we need to for fire prevention. I just say we should not pretend that it comes at no cost. And no losses, no downside to whatever choices we make. Let's take responsibility for them. And the more measures we can take to minimize continued loss of our natural heritage, the beauty we take for granted, the more we can bequeath to future generations. And here's something else, to really home in. Extinction isn't just the winking out of the last individual in a species. It's the relentless bleeding away of within species diversity, viability, geographic range, and ecological significance, leading to that last sad death. So why does caring for what grows where you are live matters? Well, it's a sum total of biodiversity. Every place harbors unique assemblages. I want to go on here and point out, okay, so even if you really want to work in other places, your credibility depends on what you're doing here. If you go to someplace else around the world and say, you shouldn't be doing this, and they say, well, how are you treating your backyard? What do you say? And if not you, then who? So, and I love this quote by Ertter. Including, besides, it makes us happy. So that's it, other than acknowledgements. And thank you very much for listening for my extended period.